left off talking about California Indians and treaties. As I mentioned in the end of the last lecture, that in 1850 there were 18 treaties negotiated. However, the U.S. government never ratified those treaties. So what happened over time were there were executive orders that were passed by the federal government to set aside for lands in Southern California. However, there were never any executive orders that were signed for lands for Northern California tribes or Central California tribes. So in 1906, there were 82 rancherias that were created for Central and Northern California Indians. These are vastly smaller than most tribal nations have. Rancherias are just like small parcels of land that are available for California Indians. And note that this didn't happen until 1906 for California Indians. So during this time period, California Indians are facing boarding schools, they're facing the fact that they don't have a lot of tribal land, and enters this era of termination. In the late 1940s, early 1950s, post-war, the federal government decides, as you learn in your textbook, to cut spending. So one of the methods of doing this is a policy called termination. The idea of the federal government was that they were going to terminate their fiduciary obligations to Indians, and with that, they would no longer have to pay anything for Indian tribes for health care, for anything associated with treaty rights. So the idea that they could cut that spending and assimilate Indians seemed like the best case scenario. So California was quickly targeted with the idea that the BIA operations there in California were highly inefficient. There was sentiments that California Indians did not want any sort of relationship with the federal government, and it was pretty much the idea of the federal government that most California Indians wanted to be assimilated during this time. Note, however, of course, that in many cases they neglected to speak with California Indians about these ideas. So under the Termination Act, despite having not spoken to California Indians, what you would learn later is that many California Indians did not know they had been terminated. Those treaty rights were no longer in existence, and a lot of things came out of this termination. So between the years of 1956 and 1958, 41 California tribes were terminated under 3 successive acts by the federal government. Under those acts, there were conditions that were supposed to be met prior to the termination of that relationship with Indian tribes. First, the majority of the tribe was to approve the termination. As I mentioned before, unfortunately, most Indian tribes did not know that they were being terminated and that their rights as a sovereign entity in the United States was being terminated as well. The second condition of termination was that the federal government was supposed to come in and provide a land survey, upgrade sanitation, roads, and waters within the rancheria. Because what would happen is that the Indian people would then be owners of the land, they could sell that land, and they would be property payers, so they would have taxes that they would need to pay. So those upgrades were important so that they could live self-sufficiently on that land. So during that time, as you also read in your textbook, another policy comes to fruition, the idea of relocation. So the federal government thought, hey, if we can't terminate Indian people, what we can do is that we can relocate them off the reservation so that this idea of community or where they kind of take care of one another can be broken, and they can become more individualized so that they can assimilate into society, they can get jobs and not depend on their family like they do on the reservation. So this other idea of relocation comes to a head during the same time as termination and affects a lot of California Indians. Many California Indians choose to locate as part of this relocation program to large cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it doesn't have the intended effect that the federal government wanted. Their effect was that they would simply assimilate Indian people into mainstream society, And once again, they would not have obligations under treaties that they had previously signed with Indian nations. So the outcome in many cases of relocation is that you have kind of this pan-Indian movement that happens. All these Indian people are coming to large communities, they find one another, and they start to protest in things like Occupy Alcatraz, which happens in California, where Indian nations come together, and in 1969 they occupy Alcatraz Island. During that time saying, hey, we want some things for Indian people. And the outcome of that is that there are some improvements in Indian healthcare as well as in education reform. There is also an official end to that idea of termination as a result of the Alcatraz occupation. So as you can see, there's both good and bad that happen as a result of some of these things. The good obviously being that there are some better outcomes that come as a result of Indian people being able to go to large cities, talk to one another, and figure out that there is a need for all Indian people to come together for certain things like healthcare and education reform. So what also comes out of this is that in 1979, there is an outcry by a woman named Tilly Hardwick that termination by the federal government of Indian tribes was something that was not done in a way that abided by the law of the Termination Act. She said in her lawsuit that she brought into the federal government, and that the roads, the sewers, and water mains that were supposed to be provided under the Termination Act had never actually been delivered. And as a result of the case that she brings to the Supreme Court suing the federal government, there are 17 rancherias that are instated once again, and once again federally recognized by the federal government, giving them back their sovereignty and their rights and their ability to maintain their rights on their traditional land base. Since the Tilly Hardwick case, there have been 13 more tribes that have had their termination rescinded, and other tribes are now pursuing federal recognition who had not ever had recognition by the federal government for one reason or another. So today, think about kind of the time frame that all of this has happened. Within the span of basically 225 years, Indian tribes were taken over by the Spanish, the Mexican people, and then finally America, taking over with different ideas, different policies, different ways of adapting to the land. Ultimately, however, Indian people were the ones to adapt and be resilient. They managed to survive despite these circumstances. They managed to make choices where they could survive and maintain their culture and fight for their culture. And so today what you see in California, as you see on a lot of different Indian reservations and with Indian people in general, is that Native people today are adopting a lot of the things that are traditional practices again. So for example, they're gathering plants for traditional medicine to try to heal themselves as they traditionally did and more in tune with their cultural beliefs and ideas. They're rediscovering different traditions in terms of food. So traditional foods that they once ate and were probably more in tune with their body and their needs, they're rediscovering them. And we see Native cooks throughout the United States today bringing those back to their communities and growing those different plants within their communities and introducing them to the young people. We also see traditional land management practices happening within different reservations. So tribes are able to manage the land in a way that they see fit. And so those practices are different than what you might traditionally see. They're adopting those practices once again. So tribes are also deciding today what is important to them. Is it important for them to readopt traditional practices? Is federal recognition important for them or not? Or is it more important to teach traditional ceremonies to their young and to reinvigorate native language within their tribe. What is most important, however, is a tribe's capacity to do this in a way that they see most fit. Their ability to do this without somebody telling them what to do it in a way that makes sense for them, and to, most of all, have the capacity to do this without having to fight for those rights that were given to them, and some might say that they gave to the United States as a result of making those treaties. So Indian people today are practicing sovereignty, or practicing traditional ways in many variety of ways. But more than anything, they are resilient and they have survived, and they have done it in ways that are vast and varied and are something to bring hope for the next generation.